everyone. Welcome back to Required Readings Top 100. Like we did last week, we are switching things up and we are only talking about one of our individual top 50 books. This week, Sergio is going to discuss one of his required reading books. What book is that this week?
So this week, I'm going to be talking about Hamlet. So Hamlet, I guess you might not think of it as a book, but I tend to think of all of Shakespeare's plays as sort of individual books. You can sort of, when you buy Shakespeare, you buy the plays of Shakespeare, you can sort of buy them in a big compendium, or you can buy them individually. I tend to prefer to buy them individually. So I have actually one of my favorite copies of Hamlet, which is this Oxford Shakespeare Hamlet, which has the play, of course, but also has a lot of critical essays on Hamlet, which details the history of the play, what was the conditions of London and England at the time that the play was written, certain facts about the different folios and different copies that were printed and distributed, actors who played the role of Hamlet from the time of Shakespeare, of actual Shakespeare's life, and the players who were performing with him, all through the years to modern times. So there's a lot of critical text, but then you also have the play, and the play itself. I think these plays stand on their own. Hamlet is, of course, one of the most famous of Shakespeare's plays. Is probably the most performed. It's considered to be the best of all the tragedies. Although some people argue that the best is King Lear. Others may argue for different plays, but Macbeth perhaps. But Hamlet is probably up there as considered one of the best. The story starts in media res, which is just a fancy way of saying that it starts in the middle of things. Hamlet's father has died. His mother has remarried to Hamlet's uncle, the king's father. Over the course of the story, we learn that it appears that Claudius, Hamlet's uncle, has actually murdered his father in order to usurp the throne. One of the sort of main things that vex Hamlet, among many things, is that the proper period of mourning has not taken place. So it comes out that the king has been dead for only a couple of months. And so there hasn't been a proper period of mourning before Gertrude, Hamlet's mother, has entered a new marriage right away. And this seems very strange to Hamlet. Hamlet learns from the ghost of his father that Claudius poisoned Hamlet's father by pouring poison into his ear. Hamlet then undertakes a scorched earth policy of vengeance, and he does so by pretending to be insane. In that process, he essentially destroys many lives. He destroys the life of the woman who may be his future wife, Ophelia. He destroys the life of Ophelia's father, Polonius. He acts very, he behaves in a very unstable way, attacks his own mother. And essentially, by the end of the play, everyone's dead. And Denmark is left without a royal house and essentially the political engine that would run Denmark. There are a lot of themes in this play that I think are really sort of the driving themes that are very important. One of which is, to a certain degree, what is the validity of revenge? The ghost, who may or may not be a really reliable source, impels Hamlet to go on a mission for revenge. But one of the interesting things about the ghost is that although other characters see the ghost, guards, Hamlet's friends, they don't actually hear the ghost tell Hamlet what happened. Hamlet is told about the ghost's death in private, and so you don't know that he's necessarily a reliable source of information. And then Hamlet undertakes, as I said, this course of action predicated on the notion of revenge, avenging his father's death. But there's no real sense as to what the ultimate purpose is. Is it to discover the truth? Is it to set things right? How can you set things right when the father's already dead? In the process, treats people really, really badly, but he's also sort of frozen by inaction. And that's one of the other themes that's sort of important in the story is inaction. Hamlet seems to occupy a liminal space. What is Hamlet even? He's the prince, but technically he would have been the king upon the death of his father. But that's never even mentioned in the play. What is Hamlet's actual role in all of this? There are also other themes, one of which is just the very nature of existence. Two of the most famous speeches, the to be or not to be speech, bring up the question of existence and not just death, but whether or not living or existence is even worth experiencing in the face of inaction. And the other most famous scene is the scene in which Hamlet speaks to the skull of the former court jester Yorick. It's a very famous scene. Hamlet has returned from a trip in which the intention was that he was going to die. In that trip, actually, that particular trip in which Claudius has sort of arranged to send Hamlet to England, when Hamlet rewrites a letter that then that causes the deaths of his friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Then Hamlet returns, and when he returns, the gravediggers, which are the clowns, it's a trope that Shakespeare often uses, in which the clowns return. Where clowns appear and then speak in malapropisms. That is, that they use terms and words incorrectly, and they're digging up a pit, and in the process they reveal the bones of Yorick, and at that moment Hamlet is presented with Yorick's skull, and goes into a meditation on Yorick's life, how he remembers him. And that's also a meditation on death and the nature of existence. For one thing, the gravediggers are just sort of tossing things about. They sort of toss this skull out. They toss these bones out unceremoniously. And so then Hamlet's confronted with this skull that represents this person whom he knew well, whose lips he had kissed as a child. And that's a line that Hamlet speaks in the play. But of course, there are no lips. There's nothing left except this inanimate object. And so the play is a meditation on life. It's a meditation on death and the nature of existence. And so that's another major theme in the play. And then finally, with the appearance of Fortinbras, who's the Prince of Norway, who appears at the very end of the play after the entire royal house has died. And Fortinbras then essentially becomes the new king of Denmark just through conquering Denmark. But he doesn't really conquer Denmark. He just happens to be there. And in many ways, Fortinbras isn't really necessarily a good or bad character. In fact, Fortinbras' own father was killed by Hamlet's father in a duel. But Fortinbras sort of steps into the role and in some ways represents stability, whereas the royal house of Denmark was unstable. It was unstable through murder and through lying and through murder and through usurpation. Hamlet remains a play that is, well, again, probably performed the most often of any of Shakespeare's plays, but it also sort of appears in modern films and books. For instance, The Sons of Anarchy, which was a television show that ran for 6 or 7 seasons, is the Sons of Anarchy is a show about a motorcycle gang in California. but the framework is built in the Hamlet model. In the show, the HBO show miniseries Station 11, the end of the show occurs when Hamlet is actually performed in this sort of enclosed society that's been built in this airport, and it's a key moment in the show. And Hamlet, which is probably the hottest book right now, and of which there's a really, really popular movie that's probably going to win all the awards. Hamlet is sort of predicated on the notion that, to a certain degree, that the play Hamlet was a response to the death of Hamlet, the 10-year-old son of William Shakespeare, who died from the plague. And then this leads to this brilliant play that Shakespeare wrote, of which the major question is an existential one, which is the meaning of life and death. And so it continues the Hamlet continues to be pervasive in modern culture, and it appears in many different places, in books and in media.
You mentioned nature of existence. You mentioned a couple of other larger ideas or umbrella concepts that William Shakespeare tries to relay in his writing. I'm wondering what your ideas of free will versus destiny are within the confines of Hamlet. What was Shakespeare trying to say? So what do you think Shakespeare, again, is saying about various characters and their relationship to free will versus destiny?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So, in some Greek philosophy and like Hellenistic philosophy, there's this notion that you don't have free will because everything is actually planned out and moves in a precise way. And then that brings up the question as to whether or not you're responsible for your actions. And different philosophers sort of make different arguments about the nature of free will and the nature of the actions that people embark on. So are you really at fault for murdering someone when in fact you have no free will, and so therefore the murder was preordained? There's this notion of the fates. And so you see for instance, the epic poems by Homer, of which Shakespeare was really influenced by, the gods cannot intervene in the action of men. So the gods can sort of, there are moments when the gods are sort of discussing about whether or not they're going to step in and save their children who are in the battlefield, in the Iliad, and in the battlefield that's taking place between the Trojans and the Greeks, and whether or not they're going to save Paris, or they're going to save Memnon, or they're going to save Achilles, or they're going to save Hector. And all of these figures are the favorites of the gods, or in some cases they're the children of the gods, so they're sort of heroes. And no matter what happens, the idea that the gods always state is that you cannot save them because they are fated to die, or this is fated to happen. Fate ultimately is the greatest driver of existence in Greek epic, and I think the same applies here. I think that if you think about about Hamlet's position, he is not really in a position of choice. Choice is never really a matter for him. He never really has free will. There's no question that he's going to take revenge. The real tension isn't whether or not he's going to take revenge. The real tension is the inaction of revenge. There is constant delay. There are moments when Hamlet can take action and then doesn't. There's a moment. So in the moment in which Hamlet kills Polonius, he does so under the assumption that the person that he's killing, who's behind the tapestry, is Claudius. There's no question as to whether or not Hamlet is going to kill Claudius. It's a question as to when. And when it turns out that it's Polonius who he has killed, Hamlet shows some sorrow at having killed an innocent person. But the sorrow is really more of the fact that the person that he killed isn't actually Claudius. Um, there's another moment in which Claudius, who now understands that Hamlet knows that Claudius has killed his brother, father of Hamlet. Claudius is praying. At that moment, Hamlet appears and is essentially can kill Claudius completely undefended. He doesn't because Claudius is praying. And so if Hamlet kills Claudius while Claudius is praying, Claudius will then go to heaven. And so Hamlet wants to avoid that happening because he believes that Claudius shouldn't go to heaven. Hamlet shouldn't kill him under those conditions. So he delays Claudius's murder. There's never a question as to whether or not Hamlet's going to kill Claudius. It's just a matter. It's not a matter of if, but when. And so therefore there is no free will. And the tension really is as to the delay of the vengeful act of killing Claudius. That's where the real tension is. So there's no free will as I see it, and others of course can argue differently, but yeah, there's no possibility of free will. Something has happened. The ghost comes, and the ghost is the engine that starts the sort of whatever the vehicle of the play towards the act of revenge that Hamlet has no choice but to enact.
I wonder though if the tension actually is occurring because Hamlet knows, maybe subconsciously, that it is his fate to seek revenge, but that he's now on the conscious level wrestling with the free will that he does ultimately, or maybe not ultimately, but he thinks he might have a choice in the matter. And that actually kind of creates that inner tension.
Yeah, I mean, there may be ambiguity as to whether or not there is free will in Hamlet. My sense is that when you look at, for instance, the to be or not to be speech, that speech happens in a very sort of key moment in the play, and the question is about the nature of existence, but it is also about the futility of existence in the face of inaction. The inaction being that Hamlet hasn't yet killed Claudius, or that Claudius hasn't died, that revenge hasn't been completed. And so there's never any ambiguity about that. And therefore, it's just the delaying of the act. And again, when Shakespeare was deeply influenced by the classics, and especially Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And what you see a lot in those poems is that delaying what is fated doesn't necessarily mean that what is fated isn't going to happen. I.e., Hector is meant to die at the end of Hector is meant to die at the hands of Achilles, and Achilles, by staying in Troy, is doomed to die at Troy and to never go home. The gods intervening, all that does is simply delay the inevitable, which is that these figures are going to die, because fate is supreme above all, and that there is no free will. Of course, the other side of that is whose lives are destroyed in the process. In the case of Hamlet, there are a number of people whose lives are destroyed because of this. And the longer that Hamlet delays in the act of vengeance, the more that peripheral characters are hurt, specifically Ophelia, and her father Polonius, but there are others as well.
Mm-hmm. So we just got back from London, and one of my favorite paintings in the whole world is John Edward Millet's Ophelia in the Tate Britain, which we did get to see.
Yep.
Hamlet has been interpreted across almost all art forms. or all art mediums. What would you say is your favorite interpretation of Hamlet?
My favorite interpretation of Hamlet.
I mean, you sort of touched upon it a little bit with the TV shows like Sons of Anarchy, and again, that can even be a medium that we can.
Yeah. Okay, so actually, so I guess I have two. So the first one is, and maybe this might seem embarrassing or even shameful among like people who really love Shakespeare, but actually, I would have to say it's Mel Gibson's Hamlet, which was directed by, I believe, Franco Zeffirelli. And it came out, I don't know, sometime in the early 90s, 90, 91, 92. And at the time, Mel Gibson was a huge star. He was kind of coming off of the Lethal Weapon movies, I think the first couple of Lethal Weapon movies, which were action movies in the 80s, which as a really young kid I enjoyed. Um, he was also in the Mad Max movies, the original ones, again from the 80s, which I really enjoyed. And so I sort of, I guess you could say as a kid, I was a bit of a fan of Mel Gibson. At the time that his version of Hamlet came out was probably around the time that I also read. No, it is actually. It is actually around the time that I first read Hamlet. So I read Hamlet initially in my AP English class. In fact, I would say that a lot of, I can't quite remember if we had done Shakespeare much in my English classes before the AP English class. I would say probably maybe a little bit, and also in drama because I was in the drama department. But it was through the AP English classes. And we were watching a lot of, not only were we reading Hamlet and a lot of Shakespeare in general, but we were reading Hamlet, but we were also watching early films of Hamlet. And the big one was Laurence Olivier's Hamlet. When you're a kid and you're like 16 years old and you're seeing this like really old black and white film where Laurence Olivier was a drama star, but it's sort of really stilted in some ways because of the style of acting. It's not that exciting to a 16-year-old, but Mel Gibson's Hamlet was exciting. I think he brought like a physicality to the role that was sort of very modern in some ways, I guess very modern. Whereas Laurence Olivier, even though he was known as a great fencer, he was very skilled at that. He was sort of very stilted, whereas Mel Gibson was like an action star. So he's like really physical. And of course you're a young guy, so you're like, oh, I'm really physical too. Like you're running around. And that was really exciting to me. And actually now that I think about it, there's two more.
I actually had a movie, or I read Hamlet also in AP English, but we watched the Kenneth Branagh version of it, which is like the full 4 hour long. Kate Winslet was in there.
Yeah.
And that definitely brought it to life for me too.
Yeah, it's funny. I've actually never seen that Hamlet. I don't think I've seen that Hamlet.
Oh goodness. Yeah, I forget the actors now. I see them in my head, but I can't remember their name. Robin Williams, and then the guy from Harry Met Sally.
Right.
They play like the clown Joker, Gravediggers.
Right. Yeah. Huh. Yeah, I've never seen that version. And I've seen a lot of them. I don't know why I haven't watched it. I think the length has...
It's 4 hours,
it has sort of deterred me a little bit. It's supposed to be great.
Yeah.
And now when I see it, because it is available on streaming services, it always seems really dated somehow. The costumes and
your Mel Gibson one isn't.
Well, I haven't seen the Mel Gibson one since it first came out.
All right, your other two.
Yeah, so the other one was actually a play that I saw on Broadway again as a kid called I Hate Hamlet, and I Hate Hamlet. Has one of the main actors ended up being in Sex and the City. He's like the bald guy who I think works in a bar. Anyway, I forget the actor's name.
Bald guy doesn't work in the bar. Steve works in the bar. The bald guy's the lawyer. Okay,
yeah. So I know. Yeah, that guy turned out to be like in a bunch of television shows and movies. But he was actually, he had hair, and he was in the in I Hate Hamlet. And Nicole Williamson, who is a famous actor of like the golden age of cinema, he was sort of like a contemporary of Laurence Olivier. Nicole Williamson plays the ghost of. Actually, I think it's the ghost of Shakespeare, who comes to. So the premise is actually that this actor, this professional modern actor, actually gets the role of Hamlet in a production of Hamlet. I think Shakespeare in the Park. And he does, but he's American, and he doesn't know how to fence. And there's all these, and of course, Hamlet has a big fencing scene at the end of the play. And so Nicole Williamson, playing the role of William Shakespeare, presents himself to this actor, and sort of shows him how to play Hamlet, like how to do a British accent and how to fence. And I really loved it. And there was actually, and this was a big, this play was kind of a big deal. And it became a big deal because Nicole Williamson, who really knew how to fence and was not a particularly maybe nice guy, when they would do the fencing scene in the play on stage, would kind of nick at the American actor, would kind of like nick him with the foil, and then that actor, the real person, had a fit on stage and just stormed off stage. And this was a big deal. And I remember my drama teacher saying, "Oh, he will never work again." And so it's not Hamlet exactly, but it's kind of a remembrance of that play. And I actually remember thinking about this, not recently, a while ago, and I thought, whatever happened to that actor? And it turned out that actor who played the sort of young man in that play ended up having a really good career anyway. And Nicole Williamson was like not really showing up to rehearsals and just being kind of a tool, just not being a particularly nice guy. But I remember that. That was great.
Third one.
And the third one is actually within the scope of the show, Station 11. In the last couple of episodes, at this airport. So the premise, really quickly, the premise around Station 11 is that there's a pandemic that kills everyone. And so you have these little groups of people that kind of end up in these.
Are you giving away the plot of this show? What if people want to actually see?
Well, I don't really give away the plot, but anyway, and so these people end up in these little sort of like communities, and there's this traveling group of actors called the Traveling Symphony, and they find themselves in this airport performing Hamlet to the people in the airport. And two of the people in the airport are actually former actors, one of whom was a really, really famous actress, and another one had been an actor when he was younger but ended up becoming something else. And they play the role of Gertrude and Claudius. And their performances and the performances of some of the sort of actors, so the play within the play, are actually really quite wonderful, and it shows how the power of theater to sort of heal old wounds, and also sort of show people what they want, what are the things in life that they want, even in the wake of a pandemic, is really evocative. And so even though it's not the entirety of the play, and in many ways it's adapted to within the scope of the show, it's really evocative. So I would say those are my three favorites. Mel Gibson's Hamlet. I Hate Hamlet. That's the name of that play. I Hate Hamlet. And Hamlet as performed within the scope of the show are three of my favorite representations of Hamlet.
So you're still going to go with the performance of Hamlet as opposed to any sort of paintings, or maybe there's some person that made a collage, or I don't know, an architectural interpretation of Hamlet. You're still going with plays?
I'm going with the performances because I ultimately I think that Hamlet is a performance. It's meant to be performed, and oftentimes reinterpretations are really, really interesting. So, you mentioned the Ophelia painting. Mm-hmm. I don't have the same response to the Ophelia painting as I think a lot of people do. Certainly as much as Swifties do. Where now they've sort of discovered that there's a link there to the recent Taylor Swift album. The Ophelia painting is interesting, and Ophelia as a character is interesting. Because she is truly, out of all the characters in Hamlet, she is the tragic figure in Hamlet. It's not Hamlet. It's not Claudius. It's not Gertrude. It's not really even Polonius. It's not Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, although that's debatable. It really is Ophelia. Ophelia is the person who is the least at fault in Hamlet, and the one who suffers the absolute most in Hamlet. So she's an interesting figure.
Well, interesting enough, I have a question about Ophelia. So obviously the death of Ophelia happens sort of off stage. And it's just slightly mentioned to Hamlet by Gertrude, I think, that, Ophelia, died. So in the last 400 years, where we have had plays and interpretations, TV shows, movies, books, art, some people have taken it upon themselves to bring that scene into the show, into the spectacle of the performance itself, even though in the play it doesn't happen. So what do you think that says about our human desire to scream about something when the literature only whispers about it?
Yeah, so yeah, I think there's a tendency. So the parts of these plays that are the most evocative are usually the scenes in which, in the characters' death scenes, and those are the things that kind of stay with us the most. Hamlet is kind of sometimes most famous because they say it's the bloodiest of all of Shakespeare's plays. It might be easy to think that it's Macbeth. Or it might be easy to think it's maybe like, I don't know, Titus Andronicus. But in no other play, and I remember this, and it's funny because I'm saying this from having read something many, many years ago, or maybe even in a class or something, but Hamlet is the bloodiest of the plays, and where the most number of people perish. You have Rosencrantz and Guildenstern off stage. You have mention of Yorick, that's off stage and by a number of years, so I don't know that really counts. You have Ophelia, you have Gertrude, you have the king, which happens before the play, off stage. So it is the bloodiest, or one of the bloodiest plays, but most of this happens off stage, and this is in line with ancient tragedy. So what do people remember most about ancient tragedy? It's the way that Pentheus is the way that Pentheus dies in the Bacchae. It's the way that Hippolyta dies in that same play. It's all of these. Basically, the violence happens off stage, and Shakespeare sort of continues that tradition somewhat, not fully, but somewhat. For instance, Lady Macbeth off stage. You only hear about it. And in the case of Ophelia, that's true, obviously. But there's something, again, there's the tragic aspect of what happens to Ophelia is something that is so striking that I feel that a lot of times performances feel the need to show it. And I don't know the history of the performance, how much of that over the course of 400 years, when that begins to change. But I would imagine that it really begins to change, and I could be wrong about this, but it really does begin to change in the 20th century. And I think that you do probably have performances today that are really sort of they stick very close to the text, and they're sort of traditionalist performances, and others are much more modern. So, for instance, we were talking about Mel Gibson's Hamlet because I mentioned it. So why not continue in that vein? Ophelia is shown dying. The scene is shown, and of course, at the time, the actress playing the role is Helena Bonham Carter, who was sort of becoming a star, and so you really want to see her. It was very important in many ways, but I think and also sort of modernist takes as well. Wanting to show sort of what happens to this tragic female character who is utterly destroyed, again, through no fault of her own, and through the bad behavior of the other characters. I think that we tend to want to see the blood and guts more in today's society, definitely. So I think there's something about that. But I think that there's something about Ophelia that, I mean, going back to obviously the painting that you mentioned, in that it's so evocative, it's so shocking and sad that in many ways it's become, it's not, I don't want to say it's peripheral to the story because that's not really fair to it, but it's something that it sticks with people, and something that was meant to be somewhat peripheral to the overall story, the overall arc of the story. It's so evocative and people were so affected by it that there is a need to show it, rather than just sort of suggest it through secondary and tertiary characters, which is what happens in Hamlet. Mm-hmm. It is mentioned, Hamlet overhears it, mm-hmm. and sort of laments it, but it never changes its course of action. And I think that's even more shocking, which is why I think that there's a need to represent it, whether it's in paintings or in film or in stage performances.
Mm-hmm. Going back to what you said earlier about Hamlet's inaction, or the tension coming from his inability to act, I think a lot about the concept of analysis paralysis and all of the things that when we start to overthink options or decisions, we end up not doing anything. And then it was a few years ago, I heard the expression that the only bad decision is not making the decision at all. What would you say is the modern day takeaway from Hamlet about either the analysis paralysis or just in general? What is your takeaway? What is the application of Hamlet today? I mean, we've got maybe high schoolers still reading Hamlet and maybe having the same feelings that I, or maybe you did too, like, why are we reading this? What is that? What is the reason to read it?
Well, I think one of the things about Hamlet and the inaction, the paralysis, is that the ultimate result of his actions, it's ambiguous whether or not these are good or bad. In fact, the tendency is that it's probably worse. So the death of the father, the poisoning of the father, is unquestionably bad. I don't think there's any ambiguity about that. The usurpation of the throne, although, that always feels a little bit underplayed in Hamlet, but the usurpation of the throne, the poisoning of the father, is undeniably bad. But if Hamlet doesn't take action, then, well, the action that Hamlet takes, you can make the argument that it's purely a personal act and that it's not in the interest of society at large. So in Hamlet, and it depends on how you perform it or how you read it, but in Hamlet, there is no sense that what has happened on a geopolitical level is necessarily a bad thing. Society continues to function as it always has. The royal house remains stable as it always has. Although royal houses are never stable, but the Denmark's overall position doesn't change. People are happy that the only person who's unhappy about the marriage of Gertrude and Claudius is Hamlet. No one else is. It's a celebration that there's this marriage. No one else really seems to question whether or not Gertrude has really waited the appropriate amount of time in the wake of her husband's death, in the act of mourning. There's no one questions that per se. Hamlet is sort of brooding about while everyone else seems to be happy. So the overarching geopolitical, if you want to use a modern term, structure of the society isn't actually harmed. It's just one person who is upset about this. If he does nothing, then everything just continues as it was before. Perhaps Hamlet goes back to school because he's a scholar, and Gertrude and Claudius rule over Denmark, and maybe Hamlet eventually marries Ophelia, and they have children, and then eventually Hamlet becomes king because his parents, as the normal course of things, die, and so nothing changes. Hamlet's action causes a cascading effect that essentially launches Denmark into an extremely unstable position in which it can't really defend itself, in which the order of things are broken. If you look at the world at large, bad things happen all the time. And those bad things are morally horrible in many cases. The reaction to those bad things, however, may break the world order in such a way that may be worse. It's debatable.
So you're essentially saying do nothing and all will work out.
Well, I think that sometimes, I think the message in this is in this story is highly ambiguous, because what Hamlet does causes a great deal of unrest and of instability. The story seems to suggest that overall, what Hamlet is doing may be actually driven by personal selfishness more than what's good for society as a whole. And there's a great deal of ambiguity. Now, as a teenager, how does this apply to you? Well, that's debatable. I think one of the things that I think is often understood or maybe underanalyzed or what have you is that a lot of what happens in Shakespeare in general is actually generational, and in many ways, Shakespeare there's a lot in Shakespeare in which he's sort of criticizing the impulsiveness of young people. You see this somewhat in Romeo and Juliet. So Romeo and Juliet is famous for being this like story of star-struck lovers, star-crossed lovers, whatever you want to call it. But and the whole thing of like the warring families and whatever, what you might have, whatever. But also, in the beginning of Romeo and Juliet, Romeo is not talking about Juliet. He's talking about a different character that he's in love with, that he's really like in love with, he's mentioning over and over again. And then he sees Juliet, and he's like all of a sudden in love with Juliet, and this other character is totally forgotten. And it's very impulsive. And what Romeo ends up doing is greatly destabilizes the overall structure of the world that he lives in.
Mm-hmm.
And he ends up doing everything for ultimately selfish reasons, not for reasons that are good for his group or good for his family or good for his gang or whatever you might want to call it. It's good just for him. And that causes destruction, overall destruction. It causes the deaths of the two main characters, of course. In Hamlet, as awful as the death, as awful as the assassination of the king actually is, ultimately Hamlet is acting he's acting for selfish reasons, and it's not for the good of the overall society. It's just for him, and the story seems to sort of direct it in that directed in that way. And should Claudius be king? Yeah, probably not. Should he be outed in some sort of way? The answer is probably yes. But there's no evidence to actually suggest that he committed this crime. Mm-hmm. That's a problem in the story, is that you have a ghost, an apparition. Other people see the apparition, but the confession or the great reveal happens in private. No one sees it but Hamlet. So can we really know if this is true? And then the other side of it is also, the other thing that's sort of a reveal is when the play within the play happens, and Hamlet essentially has these players recreate the poisoning scene, and Claudius has a fit as a result. That's the only evidence you have. You don't really have actual physical evidence. And so that casts that there's some ambiguity there. And so Hamlet is really acting out of selfish impulse.
So all in all, a real good moral.
A really good moral.
Don't be selfish.
Don't be selfish. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much for watching this week's episode of Required Reading. If you read Hamlet as a kid, or you read Hamlet perhaps in college, or you're just reading it now, definitely drop some comments. What are your opinions about these questions? Does Shakespeare's Hamlet touch upon fate, destiny, or free will? What is your favorite reinterpretation of Hamlet in any art medium? Or what do you think about the analysis paralysis of Hamlet and his inaction? We will be back next week with another episode of Required Reading. If you made it this far, make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you are notified of any upcoming episodes. It's free for you, but it means the world to us.